and Danny, it's always a pleasure to have you at our event. So over to you, and your 15 minutes is about to start. So put yourself into present mode, please, and off you go.
Lovely. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all here. My name's Danny. I'm a teacher and teacher trainer at International House, London. Unlike Lisa, this is my first online conference. I've been teaching for about 25 years. It took me about 10 years to go from being a teacher to presenting at my first conference, maybe 10, 11, 12 years. It's taken me 5 weeks from my first lesson online to presenting at a conference. So I'm a little bit more nervous than usual. But I thought this would be a nice one to share. It's just a time when I brought a guest speaker into my class I enjoyed the lesson. I enjoyed how it worked. I liked how it worked. So I thought it'd be nice to share. It's something I have done in the face-to-face classroom before, but I thought it would work really well on Zoom, the platform we're using. And it did. Feel free to throw into the chat whether you've done this before, and I'll run through how I did it. Okay, why do it? I think firstly, there's the potential to learn about new and interesting things. And when I talked about this with colleagues at International House London, they talked about the kind of people they could bring in. So care workers, for example, came up, people who did interesting jobs, people in far-flung places. So you can really get your students to learn things that maybe they won't find in course books. It brings the outside in. So in London, even though my students are in London, they often talk about how difficult it is sometimes to get to talk to people outside. So it's nice to bring someone in for students to chat to. It gives exposure to authentic language and communication. That is, if you choose to have an unscripted lesson. The lesson I did with my friend, my guest, was completely unscripted. I mean, we knew what we were going to be talking about, we knew what we were going to be doing, but we hadn't created a script at all. We hadn't thought of any particular language point we were going to work on. And it also exposes the students to different voices, different accents, that sort of thing. And it's a nice change of pace and routine. You'll see later on when I share the students' views of the time I brought the guest in, how they viewed it as that, a bit of a change from the norm. And it's very emerging language rich. For those of you who've seen me speaking before, this is my thing. I'm really into working with learner language and looking at the language they use and upgrading and reformulating and modifying learner language. And getting a guest in is great for doing so. And I'll show you why as the talk progresses. So I haven't got any kind of research findings for it, but I think it must be incredibly motivating just to sort of spend time having really authentic communications with a proficient language user. And that's what the guest brings. So this is my guest. He is a friend of mine. His name is Kadish. He's from Turkey. He's a teacher. And we were just chatting on Facebook, and I said, oh, do you fancy coming in and being a guest in one of my lessons? And I promised him I would do the same, but that hasn't happened yet. But the promise stands, Kadish, if you're actually here, that I'll come in and do a session with you one day. So just to start, I got Kadish to, when he arrived, he has his profile picture on the Zoom welcome page. So I basically started off by getting the students to guess who he was, because I thought this would be a nice little activity. So I just said, who do you think this is? And these are the kind of things that came up. They were sort of thinking about what he does, where he's from, you know, what's he like, how do I know him, and why is he here? A lot of people actually guessed that he might be a teacher. And one big recommendation, tell your guests to change their name on the Zoom profile, because I had 2 Turkish students and they guessed straight away, Kadish, that he was Turkish, and that helped them guess that he was a teacher. So I think it's good just to have, maybe make them change their name to guest or make up a name, so that the students start off just trying to guess who he is and why they are here. So this is Kadish. Kadish, being a teacher, had actually created, well, this is the material, this is it. I'm afraid I can't tell you where he got this. I can't remember, but it's an app that you can type in a headline and it creates a newspaper story. You'll see it's in Latin, but it creates the headline for you. So Kaddish decided to do a little sort of prediction activity. This actually happened to him many years ago. So 8 Turkish youths interrogated by the FBI. He asked the students to predict what the story was about, because they were then going to talk to him about it. He was going to share his story. They were going to chat to him. Feel free to share your predictions. Yeah, what do you think happened? And here's the first bit of emerging language. There was actually emerging language coming earlier with the guessing who Kaddish himself is. But this is all just coming from the students. I've put in bold all the language that I ended up reformulating. So they're making predictions. He was probably using lots of modals like could be, might be. Lots of nice lexes coming up. Misunderstanding, serious incident, look like a bad guy, look like a suspect. They actually ended up having quite a nice little chat about the preconceptions of immigrants or prejudice against immigrants, because they wondered whether that had been what was behind the incident. And someone suggested maybe Kaddish had committed a crime. So lots of emerging language. So as I said earlier, you're not coming in with a pre-planned language point to teach. It's all coming from the students. And this was very, very rich as they tried to work out what had happened to Kaddish. So Kaddish then tells his story. So these are the things you can get your guests to do. They can come in and just tell a story, so you can do a live listening. They could come in and you could talk to them. You could interview them, or they could interview you. So the students listen to a live interaction. Or they could do an interactive listening themselves, where the students can interject. And Kaddish said it was okay for them to interject if they had any questions or comments. So basically, Kaddish told his story. He was working with the States with some friends. I think it was 5 friends. It may have, oh no, it's 7 friends, because there were 8 of them, weren't there? And they'd gone on a trip afterwards. They'd hired a car, gone on a road trip. They'd stopped at a toll booth and got questioned, and they had pictures of bridges and things on their cameras. So they were interrogated for the FBI, by the FBI, under suspicion of being potential terrorists. So that was what happened. So yes, Kaddish then tells his story. What we then did is we got the students to then go off to breakout rooms, and they were going to prepare to interrogate Kaddish. They were going to pretend to be the FBI. It hadn't been a traumatic experience for Kaddish, so they thought it was okay for him to relive it. Students went off. I think it was 3 in each room, because I only had a class of 6, but I think you could do this with a class of 12 or a class of 18. Something like that, and they just prepared the questions. Now, I was then going around the breakout rooms monitoring to help with the questions. Kaddish, being a teacher, he felt okay to do that too, but your guest doesn't have to. Your guest could just sort of wait in the main room for this to finish. They then took turns to interrogate Kaddish. So they took turns asking questions. They didn't do one interrogation, then another interrogation. So they kind of picked the best questions and interrogated Kaddish. Interesting that one of them had said that I'm going to make him sweat. It was quite a funny thing that he kind of got into the role of the bad cop. And what's lovely about this, and this is what I mean by being so great for emergent language, I'm just sitting there monitoring and noting down what I can work on in the feedback stage, and so much language is coming up, and I'm capturing it all because I'm not having to think about student participation. I'm not having to think about my responses. I'm just prepping. I do tend to write it down on a piece of paper, but you can obviously write straight into whatever screen you're using. So you could do it in the chat function. You could do it using a PowerPoint or even a Word document. We use Smart Notebook at International House, but it's so easy to monitor. These are the kinds of things that were coming up again. Strip search, doing blood tests, wiping the cameras, lots and lots of language coming up that I could then deal with once Kaddish had gone. So I really recommend this actually for newer teachers, because it's just a really good way to listen to your students interacting, and it's not running out of steam because someone else is running things for you. Me and Kaddish met up afterwards and chatted. He thought maybe it would be a good idea if you could do the alibi. I love the alibi game. So you could split the students into Kaddishes and FBI agents, or Kaddish and his friends and FBI agents. So the agents go and prepare questions in one breakout room. The suspects can prepare their stories and have to get their stories straight in the other breakout room, and then they get back together. Going back to Kaddish's idea earlier, Kaddish's handout earlier, students could then write the story under the headline. So that might be something that you could set for homework if you wanted to. So really, just to finish off, the reaction from the students, nice. It's really nice word, that they recognized that listening and speaking practice were what was coming up. And again, this student coming here, I haven't, by the way, changed. These are genuine interactions. So Curious, that's the student spelling, because they sent this to me on chat. They like the listening and speaking. Shame none of them are recognizing the work done with the emergent language and all the sort of lexis they're getting, especially as I compile it and send it out at the end, so they have a kind of Word document with all the new language on it. Creative and funny was very, very nice. But this one was the one I found most interesting. I really liked how far I participated. I didn't feel I had any students who struggled to participate, but it's nice that a student feels they did. They talked about a different dynamism, but I thought very interesting, the bottom bit, it's good to happen on a temporary basis. I don't think you could overdo your guests. So that was one guest in 5 weeks. I think I'd be prepared to do it every 5 weeks or something like that. And obviously try and have a very different dynamic. So I think if I had a different guest, rather than get them to tell a story and do a live listening, I'd perhaps get the students to interview them instead about sort of what they do or something like that. Okay, well, that is my talk. I hope you enjoyed it. I think I probably have a little time. That's my WordPress there at the bottom. I'll probably put my slides up there eventually. But yes, it probably leaves me time for questions.
Yeah, you've got a few minutes, Danny, if you want to take some questions.
Right, well, okay, so the question I've got, what if the students aren't that interested, what do you do then? I think that could be the case if you were setting up any speaking activity. I think by putting the students into breakout rooms to create questions together, it means that you can sit out if you wanted to, because they're compiling the questions and then you choose if you answer the question. I found my students were very, very interested in Kaddish because, you know, a guy being arrested by the FBI and interrogated was naturally very interesting. So I think you do what you normally do in class. Students are working together so that you're not making a student have to participate if they don't want to. Tanya, have I got time for another?
Yeah, you're fine.
Actually. Doing this for lower levels, I absolutely would. Mine was in an intermediate class. I should have mentioned that. I think you could definitely do it at lower levels. I don't think I do Kaddish's story, but the reason I would do it at lower levels is because it's emerging language rich. So as long as the speaker can kind of attune their voice to a lower level, so I recommend bringing in a teacher to do it, you can work with what's emerging from the students. So they could interview someone about their job, for example, or they could interview someone about where they live. You might bring in a family member and they have to kind of guess who it is and ask questions that way. So I think you can, I always believe you can do things with lower levels. Yeah.
Danny, there was a question into the chat box, which you kind of just answered there a little bit. But any suggestions for how you get guests in the classroom?
I think mine your friends, mine friends and former colleagues. So Kaddish is a friend and a former colleague. So we were just on Facebook one day and I said, oh, you know, what's going on with you in lockdown? Do you fancy coming and doing a class? And he said the same thing. So I think Facebook friends, but you know, there's a few hundred people on here today. You could all start asking each other to come in and do things because we are a lovely network in the International House well, the English language teaching in general, it's a lovely network, a lovely family. So I think there's plenty of people who would do things, friends, family, colleagues. Yeah. Get Sean to do it.
And what prep, I mean, I know Kaddish is a teacher, so he kind of knew what he was coming into, but have you had any other guest speakers where you've needed to prep them a little bit more?
No, I've spoken to other people. One of my people who I was thinking of doing was my brother. I never got around to asking him, but with my brother, he's a chef and now yoga instructor. I wouldn't have got him to do any prep because I would have got the students to ask him questions. So I'd have said, my brother comes in, they have to maybe guess what he does, then he tells them, then he just has to answer questions. Probably I'd have had a little run through with him so he didn't speak too quickly or didn't grade his language down too much, so he spoke very slowly and didn't challenge them enough. So I think if you've got a guest in who wasn't a teacher, I would go for the Q&A option rather than the share story option.
Great. Okay, I think we're done with questions. I'll come in.
Okay, and I'll stop sharing. Lovely.